Hello and welcome to Conversations. I'm Jim Below, your host. Very pleased to have joining me back today State Senator Rebekah Warren from the 18th District. Welcome back to Conversations.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
And it's the end of the 2017 calendar year. You're finishing up your 7th year as a member of the State Senate.
Right.
Going into your final year. Has it been what you really expected it to be over these almost 2 full terms?
Wow, it's so interesting. It's a great question. I came from the House where my party was in control, so I started my elected service at the state level, chairing a committee and helping set an agenda. Going into the Senate, being in the minority, it's a really different atmosphere.
You mentioned being in the majority. At that time, the Senate, though, was Republican-controlled, wasn't it?
Right.
So you still had some give and take.
You did. First, absolutely. Absolutely. But it is very different being in the minority, and my party is in the super minority, and I'm the only woman Democrat left in the entire state Senate. So I'm really the minority of the minority.
Yeah.
So that is a little bit different. But the nice thing about the Senate is a lot of us have worked together for a long time. Many of us came from the House together, so we have pretty deep relationships, and that makes it a little easier to work across those party lines sometimes when you can.
When you are trying to work with members of the Republican Party in the Senate, you mentioned those that you've worked with potentially over the full 7 years. Mm-hmm. Do you find that the disagreements are, you might say, acknowledged, that you agree to disagree and then can move on, or is there still sort of the, not animosity, but resistance to even almost talk?
So I would say, a large number of the pieces of legislation that we work on in Lansing are very bipartisan. A lot of what we do does pass with significant votes from both parties.
But that doesn't make the media. There's no reason to
it's not.
publicize
It's
that.
not as engaging as the places, I guess, where people fight, which is. But there's definitely issues, right? And we've had some big ones this year. We've had some pretty big policy conversations that honestly split people, even within parties, thinking about things like how we do auto insurance and the no-fault, requirements that we have here in Michigan. What we're going to do with weapons, and whether we're going to allow firearms in those places that have traditionally been considered gun-free zones, and our schools and hospitals. So some of the tax issues that we have looked at have really been things that both split parties and were pretty rancorous in some of the discussions.
You mentioned 2 issues which seem to get a lot of publicity during 2017 that looked like it was going to progress and then, for whatever reason, failed. One was the whole issue of auto insurance.
Right.
Is that a partisan issue for the most part, or is that more geographic almost?
I think it's not really a partisan issue, and if it was simply a partisan issue, right, Republicans right now in our state do have the majority in the House and Senate and have a Republican governor. If it was simply a partisan issue, it would have passed.
Right.
They couldn't get enough votes even in their own party, so it's not partisan. It somewhat is geographic.
Some Democratic support?
Some Democratic support. Yeah, there were 4 Democrats that voted for it as it came to the floor for a vote in the House, which ultimately they did not have enough votes to pass it. But it is, I think there's a geographic concern, right? There are some parts of the state where auto insurance really is just astronomically high and very much a burden on citizens. And so that piece of the equation really does need attention from policymakers. We've got to address the issue of rates and affordability. But on the other hand, Michiganders most of us have grown up with this pretty unprecedented benefit that if you have a loved one who has any kind of catastrophic accident, that protection is the difference between real quality of life and not. And that's what we have to get our hands around, is how do you make auto insurance affordable without giving up a benefit? Because if you have a loved one who needs that support, you want it to be there.
And that is one of the sticking points of the lifelong, you say, benefit versus some type of a cap or of a limit.
Right. Lots of other states do 2 things that we don't do here in Michigan, right? They one is, because of the way that no fault works, you don't have to litigate every single case, right? Like a lot of states, even states in our neighboring area, you basically have to go into court. If somebody hits you, you got to start with lawyers, and that just really changes the dynamic, right? And raises costs. Whereas in Michigan, we don't have that. Like you're assumed sort of.
And yet we have the highest rate what, in the country,
Well, that's
depending on how you measure
depending
it.
on how you look at it, right? And it's, but even when you take those pieces apart, it's not always really on the collision. And so people have to really kind of look, I guess, at those things, make decisions for themselves. But the other thing is that some states do cap how much sort of personal injury protection. So you hear this, the sort of the PIP choice idea that we could lower that. And some states have as low as $50,000 or $75,000 as a cap for that personal injury protection, which with the rising cost of medical benefits, $50,000 might sound like a lot if you sign up for that benefit. But again, with a catastrophic accident, if you have to get airlifted to a hospital or medical center, $50,000 is gone in a heartbeat.
But to what extent does federal health care, you say, benefits play into now the state of Michigan or other states of, you can say, who pays for what when?
Right.
You know, and
Right.
potentially that for auto insurance, if benefits are being covered by a health program at the federal level, then potentially it could be reduced then as far as individual states.
If we could get to, I mean, some of the things that are being talked about with some seriousness, I think for the first time in a long time, some kind of a Medicare for all, some kind of a single payer health plan where your health care benefits are covered, boy, it would really change the conversation. But for now, we don't have
Is there a
that.
plan for 2018 for additional discussion, or is that pretty much dead for this whole session
You know,
and
honestly,
looking more with the new legislature a year from now?
it's a good question. I mean, I've been in the state legislature for 11 years. I'll be starting my 12th year at the beginning of 2018. And every single session, some conversation about auto insurance rates, affordability, no fault. Some of those conversations happen every single session. So will they try again next year as opposed to waiting until 2019? I don't know the answer to that, but there's certainly folks who are very passionate on both sides of this debate who aren't going anywhere. So I think that we'll continue the debate.
And the debate may go on, but realistically, unless you get a sense of some of those who opposed the change in 2017, there's limited, you say, reason to put in the effort to try and get something approved before the next transition of the next session.
And it was in the double digits how many votes they were short. It was over 10, and so you'd have to really change a lot of minds. Now we're going into an election year, obviously next year, so sometimes people's positions harden, and sometimes people's positions become a little more malleable.
Flexible.
Yes.
Right. The second issue you talked about that had a lot of discussion in 2017 dealt with the opening up or making available the concealed weapon permit to be accessible in more locations. The issue a lot was schools in large, like the stadiums, that type of thing.
Yeah, when the rules were changed in the mid-90s in Michigan to liberalize sort of concealed weapons permitting, there were just a few, the shall issue as opposed to may issue. There were just a few places, about 6, that remained in the law that were considered gun-free zones, and they were things like hospitals, schools, daycares, large sporting venues, bars. So kinds of the places that I think when you talk to most people, it makes some common sense that these are places where booze and guns, or hospitals where there's high stress there. Sometimes those areas and
or
weapons
children,
just don't
in the case
mix.
of daycare and
Yes,
schools
absolutely,
and that.
right.
Yeah.
And so,
And it looked, at least it sounded as if there were the votes and the plans to present it to the governor. And there was some question because the governor had vetoed a similar proposal in past years.
Right.
But it never actually got up for the vote, right?
it passed the Senate, so the bills did go through the Senate and were passed by the Senate, went over to the House, and have not moved out of the Judiciary Committee in the House now. So they're still waiting House action at the committee level. But you're right, the governor, we spent something very, very similar, but with some, this package has some changes, but not very many, honestly, and the governor did veto it once before. So again, it becomes this whole, do you wait, because we'll have a new governor in January of 2019 as well, because our current governor is term limited. So do you just wait and those who are most passionate about these issues try again when new cast of characters in the legislature, new governor in the governor's mansion, or do they try to do it one more time this session?
And as you mentioned, the politics of that, because if you force the vote now and the governor does veto it, that then can potentially, in some districts, be a factor
Right.
and getting enough votes one way or the other, either to not approve it to go to the next governor, or more votes to potentially put pressure on and whoever the next governor is to support it or reject it.
Well, I'm sure right now people are asking a lot of the folks. I mean, there's folks on both sides of the aisle that are out there running for governor actively. I'm sure it's a kind of a question that people are going to ask the folks who are running what their position is on it. People are passionate about this issue as well, and on both sides. So I'm sure people want to know what the next governor
third
would do.
thing, which is ongoing for all 12 years or however long you've been in Lansing, is taxes.
Yes.
And in certain respects, the economy of Michigan is a little bit stronger today than it was, say, 7 years ago when you went in.
That's right.
Which then opens up a different discussion about taxes.
Right.
Where do you see that discussion going in 2018? Or is it another one of these things that there'll be a lot of talk but little action, and then wait for the next election?
So something that got a little traction right before we broke for kind of for the holiday and the end of the year. So in 2011, when I first was coming into the Senate from the House, there was a pretty substantial overhaul of both our business taxes and our personal income taxes. And what was done away with at the time were some deductions that we used to be able to get as Michiganders from our state income tax to food banks and community programs like this, community TV and our sort of public broadcasting. Some of these credits, homeless shelters, were done away with because we said those who voted for it said the economy was just not strong enough to support that. So right before we left, we did pass a bill to put those back into the tax code so people could take deductions from their state income taxes for those kinds of contributions to charitable organizations. And the argument now is that if the economy really is recovered and recovering, then maybe we can afford again to give people that extra bit of deduction for their contribution. So the House has to take action on that when they come back, if that's something they support.
And that would not be for 2018 tax season, but more looking to the future, most likely.
Well, the confusing thing for a lot of folks, right? So the 2018 season is for your 2017 taxes, so it still could be applied to your 2000
in a sense.
Right, but not to 2017 because we haven't finished it yet. But for the 2018 beginning January, we could make it retroactive to then.
Right.
So we'll see if the House agrees with us that the economy is getting strong enough to put those deductions back. But that was something unique that Michigan did for a long time, and especially at this season of the year, you see we have a lot of folks even here in Washtenaw County who are food insecure, who have challenges with housing and need to be able to spend nights in a warming shelter, and it's kind of nice if we actually have the resources to put those, sort of that little carrot for those donations back.
Well, we're going to take a short break, come back and discuss some of the specific things you're working on in this 2018. Ask our viewers to stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment.
I'm Dana Denta, host of FYI, and you can tune in Monday through Friday at 10, 6, and 10, only on CTN.
Hello and welcome back to Conversations. I'm speaking today with State Senator Rebekah Warren. Looking to 2018, what issues, what programs that you've been working on, whether it be all 7 years in some cases or just long term, that you would like to be able to try and finish up or try and work with people on the other side of the aisle to get accomplished before leaving in 2018?
There are a few things that are top of mind right now. One of which is, I've done a lot of work in the natural resource and environmental protection space, and Line 5 under the Straits of Mackinac is something that we've been putting a lot of energy into, and trying to make sure that we're doing everything we need to do to protect the health of the Great Lakes, and the fear of some kind of pipeline fracture there that could put petroleum products in our Great Lakes is very scary. We have some new developments there. We have some alternative analysis to look at in terms of some other options for us. We have a new contract signed with the company that means that they're going to encase the pipeline in some additional protective coating in some areas. And that agreement meant that we could, when there's adverse weather conditions, we can actually have them stop putting petroleum products through the Straits of Mackinac. We had the first time that happened just this month in December. So there are a lot of folks who really feel strongly that it's a 6-year-old plus pipeline. It might not be safe anymore, but making sure that we're doing the due diligence as the state.
It's been there a while.
It's been there for over 60 years, right?
Why now? In other words, what has happened in the last year that makes it a higher priority? I know some have brought up issues related to it over the years, but it's only really been the last 6 months that it seems to have really caught the attention of others.
It's been a little longer than that, but but I think part of it is the age of the pipeline, right? It's over 60 years old. It's actually almost 65 years old. It's not holding up as well as we once thought it was. There have been some cracks in the pipeline. There are places where its protective coating has worn away in areas as big as a dinner plate in multiple spaces. So it's not just a small amount of protective coating that's gone. It's a big amount of protective coating that's gone.
And spread across a large area.
Across a large area. And I think, too, that the company that owns the pipeline was solely responsible for a long time for its annual sort of inspections and making sure it was in good shape. They kept making comments to the governor's Pipeline Safety Advisory Board that there were no cracks in the coating. And when independent divers went down and saw them, then they had to admit there was. So I think there's some concern that it's an old pipeline. It's in a very, very delicate space, right, where two of our Great Lakes come together. You have a company that's on the record now having to go back and correct information that they put out there that was not accurate. So I think more people are saying, hey, we need to pay attention to this. And it's absolutely our job as the state of Michigan to oversee what's happening there. We really need to, because we're stewards of those Great Lakes, and it's a very important bounty that's in our backyard we got to take care of.
So you have the environmental concerns and continuing on in that area. Another area I know that you've focused on and have been concerned with, and you mentioned sort of in passing being the only female within the state Senate, of gender issues, and whether it be gender equity or issues of harassment and that. Are there plans or areas where the legislature can take some action in either changing, modifying, or enforcing, you could say, the law more strongly? Yeah,
there's actually some good bipartisan work that we've been doing that does need to be finished up. So your question was a good one. What do we need to finish in the next few months as my Senate service winds down? In the area of domestic and sexual violence, supporting survivors, and a lot of folks had heard about what happened in Detroit with some of those sexual assault kits that never got tested. And that's a horrible, right? That's just a horrible thing for people.
And that's still ongoing, and that's been years.
It is still ongoing. We're getting, the state put money in to help try to deal with that backlog. We passed some legislation that's now has barcodes on these kits and chain of custody requirements. So nobody should be denied justice after something like that happens because their forensic medical evidence somehow disappeared, right? We want to do everything we can. So there's wonderful progress going forward there. And we've done some things to actually, and this is part of that's undone. So past the Senate, my colleague from West Michigan, Tanya Shoemaker, and I passed some legislation through the Senate that upped the amount of money that the local organizations who help process that forensic medical evidence can get to do it. It hasn't been updated in almost 20 years, so with the cost of medical inflation, it's not really enough to take care of a lot of those kits, and to expand the number of places in communities that can actually take that evidence for us. So we're hoping that the House will take action on those bills yet next year. So again, just a place where we can help survivors make sure they get justice, make sure that they get the care that they need. So we're hoping to do that. We have a new package of bills that was just introduced around Thanksgiving time that would also do some things to help sort of victims of domestic violence, protect them from being evicted from housing if they need to move quickly, or have problems with landlords and leases if they have some challenges due to a bona fide domestic violence situation. So there's some address confidentiality bills that we're looking at. Again, if somebody's like in fear for their life, we don't want to be advertising as the state of Michigan where they are and being the weak link in protecting their confidentiality. So there's some bills that I think will have good bipartisan support and can just be one more layer of protection where we find that some of our survivors and victims are still slipping through the cracks, and we need to do more to help them.
Education. Recently, the Supreme Court ruled that the money that had been denied or withheld in teacher pensions had to now be presented or put forward.
Right. Right.
Is the state liable for any of that, or is that all the individual school districts and that? Because how is the state involved in that, and where do we go from here?
So the state actually, it started with state legislation that basically said that teachers had to put 3%, in this group of teachers had to put 3% of their salary into an account for health care in retirement. Okay. Some of our groups of teachers sued and said it was unconstitutional because we have protections for their pension, and again, this group of teachers had a promise of health care in retirement that was covered by essentially by their district, by the state. And so they immediately went to court. So that money's been escrowed. It's money that is being held at the state level, that they've continued to collect it, they've continued to hold it. But it's not an enormous hit to the state budget at this point because it's been sitting in escrow while this worked its way through the courts. The Supreme Court finally just said, yes, it is unconstitutional. We do have to return the money, and that will just be a few weeks now in January.
Now, when you say return the money, where does that money? Who does that money go to?
It goes back to the district. So the state will release the money back to the districts, like about the third week in January is what I've been hearing. The money will go back to the districts, and the districts know what teachers had this money withheld from them, and they will be essentially paying back what was withheld. So
if you're a teacher, the teacher's salary,
from the teacher's salary.
So it was money that was weekly, monthly, whatever, withheld.
Right. From their paycheck.
With the understanding it was supposed to be for health care in the future.
Right.
But now the court is saying that's not constitutional,
right.
So therefore the money should be returned to the teachers involved at this time.
Exactly right.
Okay.
Yep.
And so in that sense, it shouldn't be a financial burden on either the state or the school districts if the money's been properly
escrowed, right? I mean, that's what we've been told. So that we assume
and it's not like the legislature has spent that money on something else. Okay.
No, because it immediately went to court and was working its way through the courts, and that was a requirement that the courts put on us, is to put the money in escrow, which is good financial sense anyway, right? If we were afraid that we might lose that lawsuit, then you don't want to not have the money or have to again cut somewhere else in the budget to return this money. So the money's been escrowed the entire time. So
in looking at education over your many years in Lansing, the amount of money that the state provides to the school districts based on pupils has been reduced and is now leveling off. Is that a fair way of putting it? We won't get into how you argue numbers and whether it's been going up. But is that something that now that, once again, the economy seems to be a bit stronger, that the majority, or in working with Republicans, that additional funding for schools may be addressed this year, even if it means trading off for some reduction somewhere else, you might say?
So the healthier that the school aid fund is, the easier it is to get folks on both sides of the aisle to vote for increases in that per pupil allowance. Of course, when that fund starts to get a little bit big too, then people start to talk about different categoricals. Would it be better to put that money, and would it be better to put that money in more districts that have higher, students of higher risk, or for certain programs, whether those are kind of the vocational technical programs that people want to support, or with STEAM, or security, or all these other things, right? So there's always lots
ways
of conversations about how to spend the money. But but again, as the economy rebounds, that school aid fund is largely driven by sales tax, right? The 2 extra pennies from Proposal A that go into the sales tax. And the more people spend, the more comfortable people feel, loosening up their own personal pocketbooks, the more money we have in the school aid fund to spend. So I'm hopeful that again, that keeps getting stronger, that people are looking at investments in education. It's just so important. And we'll see. The biggest challenge we've had in that fund, honestly, is we keep, and it becomes an inter-education fight, we keep taking money out of that fund for our community colleges and higher education instead of leaving it just for the K-12 budget, which is, well, I think what most people in Michigan.
And when the proposal was approved in the 90s, it wasn't stipulated that it was just K-12. It's education.
Right, and I think if you ask most people who remember the conversations at a time, most people sort of assume and understood that it was for K-12 education because we were reducing, right, the property tax,
but
which
that also impacts the community colleges.
Right.
And not necessarily the University of Michigan, but the community colleges also were funded within a county based on property taxes.
Right, but they have a millage, so they still are. The community colleges still have options, right, for increasing funding with millages in
for general
in
operating,
their
where the Hanover Public Schools can increase certain aspects of their funding, as far as for
buildings, for capital improvements,
that type of thing. Where in the past that all came from the larger, you say, general millage that they were collecting in some cases.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's that will be an interesting one, I guess, to see if we can kind of keep the raids on the school aid fund at a minimum, so that those dollars really can go more into the K-12, which is for a lot of folks, I think, the biggest priority, because you get our students get them ready for all the things in the future in those early years, and they can have a lot more successful education experience.
In the last minute, what's been the most frustrating aspect of your 7 years that you've not been able to see get accomplished, and there's no reason to believe you're going to see it in this last year?
Well, I think one of the things that I've worked on for a long time really is expanding protections for our LGBT citizens. Michigan remains one of the handful of states where you can still be fired from your job or denied housing because of who you are and who you love, and that is incredibly frustrating. We've had some good sort of progress on marriage equality and things like that in the last few years, but in Michigan we actually know people who lose their jobs. You can get married here legally, and when your wedding announcement is in the paper, you can be fired from your job on Monday when you go back to work, and that's something that feels wrong to me in 2017.
And no reason to believe that it's going to change in the next year.
We have not seen reason to believe we'll get a hearing on that bill in 2018, although I would love it, and I'll keep working.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us today, as always, and appreciate your time and energy and what you've done and what you hope to accomplish in the next 12 months.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be here. I'd love to come one more time before I leave the Senate and round out next year's session.
Great. Look forward to it.
Thank you.
I want to thank our viewers for joining us today, and look forward to your continued support here on Conversations. Thank you.